We may need to, we need to adjust the volume at all.
Yes.
I think we might want to just a little bit. Most of you know me. My name is Rick Ghilardi. I hold the Murray Basic Chair in Catholic Studies. Before we get started this evening, there are a couple of things that are different. You probably got a hint of it up here. First, an announcement. As you know, every year in the fall lecture series, at the end of the fall lecture series, we have the Richard McCormick Conference in Moral Theology. And this year we are scheduled to have one of the United States' most distinguished moral theologians, Father James Keenan, to speak. Father Keenan had some medical situations emerge and he had to cancel. We are very fortunate, however, to have come in his place Father Mark Miller, a Canadian Redemptorist priest who is an accomplished bioethicist. Does a lot of consulting work, particularly in Western Canada. And he will be coming, but we had to change the date. So if you have Father Basic's typical voluminous notes, you will note on the back there's a change in date. It is now November 25th. It was scheduled for a week later. So the McCormick Conference is now November 25th. It's still 4 o'clock to 8:30. And the overall title of the conference is The Dying as Our Teachers. Ethical Care at the End of Life. We'll give two specific talks. One is medical and spiritual care of the dying, and the second one is ethical issues in care for the dying. I can tell you that Father Miller is a very good friend of mine. In fact, if you know, he's the godfather of one of my children, baptized two others, so this is ecclesiastical nepotism at work here. But I think you'll find him to be a very engaging speaker. He's a very accomplished ethicist who does a wonderful job of sort of communicating the church's moral teaching in ways that people can understand. So, with that, I'd like to now talk a little bit about our conference. There are two things about this series that are a little bit different. If you are a regular visitor in our lecture series, you know that we like to take on, general themes, and then we throw in some really sexy titles to draw people in for each talk. And you'll probably notice that the schedule for this series is not real sexy looking, we've got provocative topics like God, Jesus, church. The reason for that is we decided that it might be good to dedicate an entire lecture series to the basics of the Christian faith. To go back and look at the kinds of things that we affirm in the Creed on a regular basis, get world-renowned theologians to talk about how, in the light of contemporary theology, our faith can be enriched as we go back to the basics of our faith. So the title of this series is Conversations in the Faith. So that's the first thing that's new. The second thing that's new is that we don't have a podium up here. This is a one-time thing just for this series, by the way. But we thought we'd try something different. A number of years ago, I had the distinct privilege of giving a keynote address at the Los Angeles Religious Education Congress, which gathers 25,000 people from throughout the country. And to do the keynote, you actually do it in the Anaheim Convention Center arena. So I'm up on in this arena with a stage and projection screens and everything. And I remember telling people that it was like I was channeling my inner Bruce Springsteen to do this. So tonight, I hope to channel my inner Larry King or Charlie Rose, because the idea here is we're going to have sort of an interview/conversation in which I pose some questions to Father Basic. We'll do that for roughly the same time as we normally would a lecture, for about an hour. And then, as is our custom, we'll take a brief stand-up break, right? And then we'll open up the conversation and allow you to pose questions to Father Basic. Father Basic traditionally gives the first lecture in this series. He doesn't really need an introduction, but I just have so much fun doing it that we will anyway. As we all know, he is one of the most faithful and innovative pastors in the American Catholic Church today. And I think all of us who are regularly in the church. In what is a rare combination, however, in the American Catholic Church, not only is he an accomplished pastor, he is also an accomplished theologian. As some of you know, he went to Oxford to pursue his doctorate in theology. He studied under one of the great Anglican theologians, John Macquarie. He wrote his dissertation on Karl Rahner, which was published under the title Apologetics and the Eclipse of Mystery. Now, those of us in academia know that published dissertations are one of the most unreadable documents of all. In his case, that's simply, he's the exception that proves the rule. In fact, I must tell you, on a regular occasion, when I want a really clear and succinct reading of the theology of Karl Rahner, I go to Father Basic's book, Apologetics in the Eclipse of Mystery. Beyond that book, he's published across a wide range of topics, 7, 8, 10 books, I can't remember exactly, numerous articles. He's in demand as a retreat master and a consultant on all matters related to campus ministry, theology of ministry, theology of spirituality. He teaches regularly in the summers at Fordham and Notre Dame, and we are indeed blessed to have somebody who so profoundly combines pastoral sensibility and an advanced theological acumen. So please join me in welcoming Father James. We're not sure how well this whole two-stool on a very small dais is going to work.
I want to thank Rick for the introduction and for the questions. They were available to me ahead of time, and they are like 85-mile-an-hour fastballs right down the middle of the plate. And I attribute this to the fact of our long-standing friendship, or perhaps his great respect for the role of the pastor in the parish. For whatever reason, he's given me these simple questions. Go ahead.
If you noticed our lecture series, the order of the topics is somewhat unusual. If you were to look at some of the classic treatments of Christian doctrine over the ages, I'm thinking of somebody like Thomas Aquinas, his great Summa Theologiae, he began his Summa with questions about God. What's striking about our particular lecture series is that we're not beginning with God. We're beginning with the human person. And in doing that, we're actually following the framework of Father Basic's mentor, Father Karl Rahner, who in his magisterial work, Foundations of the Christian Faith, began his reflection on foundations of the Christian faith with the human person. So the first question I want to pose is, why do you think it's more appropriate to start with the human person in thinking about our faith than a more conventional approach that would start with God, Trinity, and so on?
Well, where did you get that question? I thought the first question was, who's your favorite theologian?
I do that.
Okay. Yeah, that's actually a good. We're starting with human person. I'm going to address that by thinking about two theologians and their interactions. One would be Karl Rahner, who you mentioned. His likeness is back there. The other is Hans Urs von Balthasar, contemporary of Karl Rahner, who would take a different position. If he was running this lecture series, it would look different. So I want to use them to sort of get at this whole thing. Actually, they were born 1 year apart. Rahner was a year older than von Balthasar. They both became Jesuits. They were friends. And they worked together on an outline of theology. And in that outline in theology, they were very interested in starting with the human person and seeing how you could talk about the human person and relate that to the Christian message. It was what we call very co-relational. So they worked on that together. And then at one point, von Balthasar, under the influence of the great Protestant theologian, Karl Barth, decided you can't do that. That isn't going to work. That if you start with the human person and start with talking about human experience, that you're going to end up losing the content of the Christian faith. You're going to lose a sense of miracle or Jesus or resurrection. You're going to end up in a mere humanism. So Balthasar was very critical of Rahner from then on. In fact, one of my friends of mine said a lecture that Balthasar gave when I was talking about, he said that, did you read Rahner's latest book? And von Balthasar looked at it and says, Rahner's latest book, he hasn't written a new book in 30 years. A little sharp edge on that. So they actually had some acrimonious moments as a result. Now, the two approaches would look something like this. For von Balthasar, going back to what would be the classical approach, as Rick suggested, Thomas Aquinas, where the first question shouldn't be who is man, who are we, but who is God. That's the way classical theology was done. And the feeling of von Balthasar and others is that, well, that's the proper way to begin. And you need to talk about Christ before you're going to talk about what it means to be human, because that'll be your touchstone for it. It's there's an image from Teilhard de Chardin I often use, and I'll repeat it once more to distinguish this out. Teilhard de Chardin, great Jesuit paleontologist, religious writer, divine milieu, phenomenal man, and so on, said that the human race before like the 19th century or late 18th century was like living down below the deck of a big ship. And down below the decks of that big ship, everybody who knew they were, the serfs were there, the lords were there, the priests who knew they were, lady knew their place. There were no identity crises there. And down there, a great theological book would be Thomas's Summa. And it would be assumed that if you're going to have a religious conversation down there, that the first question would be about God. Now, what Teilhard says that happened in the 19th and 20th centuries was that then some people who were living below decks of the ship, people like philosopher Hegel and Darwin, came up on the top deck of the ship, and when they got up there, they said, "My heavens, this whole thing's moving." We're moving. And what they noticed was that when you looked at the shore, now it looked one way, and a half hour later, as the ship had moved along, it looked different. And they thus discovered what we call multiple perspectives. They discovered the fact that reality looks different depending on where you're standing. Now, that's a way of getting at this distinction between down below decks. The question of anthropology, or who we are, comes like in the middle of Aquinas' Summa, not at the beginning. And that's right where it comes in von Balthasar's work. This great trilogy, it occurs in the second part of the trilogy, Theodrama. Some of the book titles and so on are in your notes. And in volume 3 of that, where he treats the human being there. Now, you might say, what are the arguments on both sides of that? For honor, begin with the human person, and you follow right along in the sequence of our lectures, although one of the speakers was out of order. But the sequence in studying theology would be human person, and then talk about God, and then talk about Christ, and then the church, and then what the church does, celebrate sacraments and live the moral life, and then finally eschatology, where's it all going and how it's going to end. That's this Bronnerian sequence, found, as you said, in his great book, Foundations of Christian Faith. Balthasar would see it another way, as would Karl Barth and others. So, now why would one choose that? What would be the advantage? I could make a case for either side, to tell you the truth. But one of the reasons for taking the Bronnerian sequence, beginning with the human, is because it's in accord with modern thought. Now, we commonly call that the turn to the subject, and we associate it with René Descartes. Descartes died in 1650 and famously did his philosophy as a philosopher. And I'm going to start with doubting everything. I'm going to doubt everything. Maybe there's an evil genius running this world. I'm going to doubt everything. So he said, what can I be sure of? And as many people know, the answer came out. The one thing I can be sure of that's true is I think, therefore I am. In Latin, cogito ergo sum. One of the few Latin phrases probably many people know. I think that's what I can be sure of. I can never mention Descartes without recalling that old joke, Descartes goes in a bar, sits down, bartender says, do you want a beer? And Descartes says, well, I think not, and promptly disappeared. That's René Descartes. That's a touchdown. René Descartes. So Descartes started modern philosophy. you know, and modern way of thinking, which was start with me. Not starting with the fact that trees out there, or the stars are up there, but starting with the person. I think, therefore I am. I know that for sure, and we'll build everything on that. It's discourse on method. Everything comes from that fundamental point. So, Rahner, therefore, I would say, is in tune with modern thought, which tends to be subjective in that sense. Now, you could immediately think of a critique, and it's Baldassar's critique, as I suggested earlier, in that of Karl Barth, that when you start playing ball in the modern world, the person who's thought of as the father of all modern theology is a fellow by the name of Friedrich Schleiermacher, a Protestant theologian. In 1799, he wrote a very important book. And that book is called On Religion, Speeches to Its Cultured Despisers. Very telling. Speeches to its cultured despisers. He's going to talk about religion, and now he's going to talk about those people who are taken with the modern world, who have become secular in their outlook, who don't want to believe anymore, who think that religion is crazy, who think that belief in God is dehumanizing in one way or another. So he went on their turf and said, I want to talk to you, and I'm going to start not by talking about God, or talking about Jesus. I'm going to talk about something that we've got in common. And that is, you feel a sense of absolute dependence just like I do. And you have a taste for the infinite just like I do. Now let's start there. We start with the person. We start with human experience. Now we'll have our dialogue. So you see the method that was used. That's the first time in modern theology. That's why he's the father of all modern theology, the theology that Rahner does. And he worked that out in the early 1800s, great magisterial works and so on. Friedrich Schleiermacher. And went on their turf, went in their world. So I'm trying to explain why I think that this is a good starting point, because we're now on the turf of the modern world. Those people you work with over there, a lot of them think that way. And so a lot of us try to train to talk to them. It's one reason why I ended up studying Karl Rahner's thought, was because I was in campus ministry. When I was doing it, I had to talk to people in the university. I had to have a starting point. And Rahner gave me a starting point to talk to them. Now, there's another reason why I think that is helpful. The critique, of course, is when von Balthasar, you're going to lose, right? Those guys are too smart over there. If I go over and talk to them like that, they're going to prove me wrong, and they're going to show that that you can't, when you start there, you don't get anyplace. And I'm going to end up losing my faith. I'm going to end up losing my sense of what Christianity is all about. That's what's going to happen. And that's what von Balthasar decided, that the project he had with Rahner wouldn't work, and you had to do it another way. So there's always a danger in making this the first lecture, or adopting this whole approach. You're going to lose the transcendence, the bite, the sense of Jesus, the miracles, the resurrection, and what that's all about. You're going to lose all of that. Now, another reason that I think it's good to move in this direction is because of the inherent interest of us who live in the modern world in the question, who am I? And who am I becoming? And of course, that's an ancient sort of thing. You know, in the temple of Delphi, they had Nophi Seauton, Greek, which meant know thyself. Know thyself. And so we have so many people today who understand that, who have an innate feeling, I got to know myself. I got to know what makes me tick. I got to know what is my blockage that's keeping me from becoming a better person. I got to know my strengths so I can find the right job in life. I have to know myself. And so there's a sort of inherent interest in that, it seems to me, that we can build on. Who are we as human beings? Who am I? And more commonly, who are we? And then, always in that evolutionary framework, because now we're on the top deck. We're on the top deck. You can't live in this world and not be on the top deck. You can't watch television and not be on the top deck. Now, some people can bifurcate themselves and live religiously below decks. But that's a tough thing to carry on. You know, some of the young people who are very fundamentalist in their outlook, they see their faith as black and white and clearly defined and everything's in order. So religiously they go below decks. But to live on the top deck, to watch MTV, or to watch quick cuts on television, anything like that, or to see multiple perspectives is to set up a real dichotomy, I think. Hard to live below decks religiously when you live the rest of your life assuming multiple perspectives and so on. So, I often ask me if I remember that question. Curveball on the outside corner.
I'm not going to get to ask another question.
Oh, you got more? I thought there's more questions.
There are more.
Oh, okay. Well, I'll stop that. Go.
It's good. Take Schleiermacher as the starting point. The wonderful text that Schleiermacher wrote, Speeches to the Culture Despisers, where he's trying to appeal to, if I understand, that sense of a feeling of absolute dependence that's built into each human. It's a favorite theme of many. I mean, Karl Rahner is very interested in that. And Thomas Aquinas would talk about how within each person there's a desiderium naturale, a natural desire for God. And one of the most famous passages from St. Augustine's Confessions, our hearts are restless until they rest in you. At the heart of theological anthropology is this sense that we are, as humans, at a deep level, fundamentally religious. We're homo religiosus. We're drawn to the absolute, to the infinite, to God, however we describe it. But here's the difficulty. In my own life, I have a good colleague, a good friend, who's a colleague at the university, who's a professed atheist. And he's not anti-religious. It's not at all like, Christopher Hitchens or some of these people who has an axe to grind against religion. In fact, he was raised Catholic. His brother works in the Catholic Church. He actually holds institutional religion in high regard. But what he says to me is, Rick, I just don't have a need for it. I don't find myself needing to ask ultimate questions. I don't feel myself grasped by ultimate, concerns. I'm very content with the life I live. And as I talk to him, the image that comes to mind is of being kind of religiously tone deaf. And the truth of the matter is, and I think many other people might have this, I've known other people in my life who just seem to be religiously tone deaf. They don't feel, or at least seem to feel, some need for a religious framework that has a place for the absolute. So I'm trying to figure out how we can make sense of our Christian conviction that all of us, at the core of our being, are made for God. And yet I think many of us know people who seem not to be that way, who seem to be hardwired differently, that are religiously tone deaf. How do we reconcile that?
Yes, well, it's certainly correct, and the tradition has always said that. You've got great examples. Augustine's restless heart, and Aquinas' natural desire for God, and my own mentor, Karl Rahner, said we had a question mark inscribed in our very center of our being. We are the question for whom there is no answer. So we've all the way along the line, the great saints and doctors of the church have talked about a dynamism of the human spirit, reaching out. So we certainly have had that in our tradition, and Paul played to that, and so did evangelist John. And I think we need to celebrate that, and that's important. Now the question becomes, how universal is that, I suppose? I mean, there's all kind of people in the room who would resonate and say, yeah, I know what it means to experience transcendence, or I've had my moments in prayer when I've been lifted up, or I've had encounters with other people and I felt the presence of God. No doubt about that. So a lot of people would resonate. And now we got to get to your friend here. I remind a friend of mine, too, a professor from years ago, who told me that he was out in the waiting room when his son was born, professed atheist, strongly that way and so on. And the doctor came out and told him that his son, was before men were in the room for the birth, came out and told him that his wife had born him a son, and he told me he fell down on his knees and had this tremendous sense of gratitude. And he wondered ever after where that came from. And he was trying to figure out what to do with it. Now that was a moment of shock that sort of opened up. If you would have asked him before that moment, he would have sounded just like your friend. Before that moment. Now, what might be happening, you said invite everybody to think of people like that. It would probably be a very different kind of person to have in mind. But that one possibility is that people have not encountered anything that's genuinely religious that would draw them out. Say, lifelong Catholics gone to Mass and it's been nothing but boring, and in the homily nothing ever happened, and singing was dragging, and nobody was friendly, and so on. So his experience of the religious ritual is not grabbing him. So he assumes, therefore, that no religious ritual will grab him. So he assumes, therefore, that he's somehow not into this religion. The same thing could happen with faulty conceptions. When people are talking to him about God, and they say, well, people talk about God in the Bible, and God is one who hates Egyptians. You can tell that because he sent plagues on them. And he killed them in the water. Moses got away and so on. So, and the guy's sitting there thinking, I'm too smart to believe in a God who hates Egyptians. I mean, yeah, I'm too smart for that. There can't be a God like that. I mean, what kind of God is that? So, my second point is that sometimes the reason the connection isn't made is precisely because of poor conceptualization, poor explanations of what the religious reality is. Now let me try another possible explanation. And that would be that for some people would be, I use the word, emotionally stunted. I can imagine the same kind of person who couldn't say to his wife, I love you. Those words just aren't going to come out of his mouth. He can't bring himself to do it. He's not in touch with his emotions, and he's not feel free to express them and so on. Now, if you had that kind of repression, then you're going to have a whole lot of trouble opening up to the religious reality, or what we would call a call from God. The other comment I would make is that very often people's behavior belies their articulation. Now, if your friend, if I meet him at a wedding reception and we get talking over a beer, and I'm probably going to pursue some sort of line where I ask, where comes the moral obligation to teach your classes well? This is what I want to talk to him about. Or any of the things he acts responsible with. I want to know, why do you do that? Now, what I'm doing in that is opening up a larger frame for him to begin to think about his life. He might never have thought of why he puts that extra work into preparing his classes. But what I've done with the question is move him, and I've often done this by the way, is move him to begin to think of his life in this larger context. Because part of the problem often is just to be so narrow-minded, so focused on what we do. I remember doing my doctoral studies in Oxford. I forgot who I was. I was so focused on doing that one day. I had to say every morning, I said a prayer that God would help me remember who I was. People who have been really focused on anything in life might remember that. Or might, recognize that experience. Really focused, you lose sight of everything else around you. We've been known that people focus on making a living, they forgot their family. It actually happened. And so that would be my other possible explanation, and also my pastoral approach to how, and I'm seeing in your eyes that you've got more questions than if I keep talking.
That's all right, that was good.
But you see, what we've got here, that is actually a great question to get at, is who are we? So in our Christian claim, we say we have infinite longings, finite capability. That's why my mentor Carl Ron said, Hans Urs von Balthasar says essentially the same thing. Heart is restless. We know they're not satisfied with anything. And I think a lot of times, if we begin to describe that carefully, people will hear it then. So that's probably the other thing that I would do with the guy. I probably want to talk to him, not just about his quest for knowledge. Well, I might do that too. Thinking about, well, what is this search for knowledge that you have? Are you ever satisfied that you got a good enough grasp on this class you teach? Do you ever feel like you've mastered this field? Oh, no. Well, that begins to open up what I call the dimension of mystery. Now there's something outside of what you control or grasp. And I find for many, he's a good example of doing it that way. But probably most people aren't professors. I'd probably come at it through talking about love and saying, well, how's the relationship with your wife? And, do you ever feel that you fall short in showing her love or respect? You ever have a sense like you'd like to be more generous, or you let her down? She needed you, and you weren't there for her. You were too busy, or too preoccupied, or too insensitive. You see what I'm doing again? I'm opening up what I call the dimension of mystery in life. And now I think I can talk to that guy and begin to, you see the Ronarian approach there, that's all that co-relational approach. If I, when I'm talking this moral obligation of the guy at the wedding banquet, then I'm asking, where does that obligation come from? Just like I want to say to Trevor, where are you going to send that thanks that you felt?
I'd like to adopt a technique that my pastor uses in homilies on a regular basis. I'm thinking of a parishioner. We'll call her Sally. She's a regular parishioner. She's been coming to Corpus Christi for years. She's been coming because she's attracted to the great music, the consistently stimulating homilies, to the active participation of the community, to the community's sense of social commitment. But lately, she's recognized a certain irritation at a key point in the Mass. And she's trying to dismiss it as, no big deal, but it sticks in her craw, and she's finally kind of worked up the courage to come to you about it. She comes to you and says, Father, I've been going to this parish for many years, and I'm a great fan. I think we're doing important work here, but I have to tell you, I'm just thrown off my game right at the beginning of the liturgy. We get to the penitential rite of the liturgy, and in other parishes, the priest will invariably say something like, let us take a moment and call to mind our sins. She says, but you oftentimes won't do that. Sometimes you will, but as often as not, you might just ask us to be quiet and settle down and be aware of the presence of the Spirit today. That's a small thing, it really is, but it bothered me, and I didn't know why until I went home and I saw an old book on the shelf that I bought about 20 years ago by Carl Menninger, titled Whatever Happened to Sin? And she says, it occurs to me that's what's bothering me. There's so much that I like about the Catholic faith, about what it is to be a Christian today, but there's also this nagging sense that we don't want to talk about sin anymore. And she says, I know, your thing's not very big, but it just sort of brought that to mind to me. Why is it that as a community we don't seem to want to start with that anymore? How would you respond?
You can have a career at that.
It's better than writing the whole talk.
Carl Menninger's book that he referenced, essentially what Menninger said was that clergy quit talking about sin at some point, and that had a terrible effect on the populace as a whole. And it produced what he called a vague anxiety that was hanging over people's head. And they didn't know why they felt bad. That's a really good way to ask that question. They didn't know why they felt bad, but they did. And Menninger said the reason is because they can't say, I have sinned and seek forgiveness. So we got this vague anxiety, sense of guilt hanging over our heads. And I do think that is a good point. And there clearly was a pendulum swing. There's some people in the room old enough to remember that pendulum swing. When the whole Catholic thing was on sin, mortal sin, hell. I mean, man, you could pile up 120 impure thoughts in about 3 days. Wow. 103 impure thoughts. I mean,
I'm impressed.
And so people would come to confession and get scrupulous about it, and there'd be a lot of homilies about mortal sin, and people read in their high school readers in public schools, not in Catholic schools. In public schools, Jonathan Edwards' famous sermon, "Sinners in the hands of an angry God, hanging by a thread, just ready for it to be cut and fall down into the fiery pit of hell." So we had all of that. And then, with Vatican II, for us, said, well, we shouldn't talk like that. I mean, that's too negative. In fact, I studied under one of the great teachers of this, Father Bernard Herrick. Said we have to have a better way of doing this theology. That we can't just be so sin-centered and so minimalistic. You know, good. I didn't steal over $100, so it was a venial sin. I'm okay. You know, I stayed for Mass until communion started or something and left. So it was all this minimalism. He was very much against that. So he said, well, you can't do that. So we have to be more positive. And it so often happens in the history of theology, moral God. I think you're right, we moved to another extreme. We moved to an extreme where, well, let's not talk about sin. And we'll talk about resurrection and peace and joy and balloons and bubblegum and make a collage. Make a collage of smiley faces. And so we saw
I
that.
can't see you doing that, by the way.
So we get this pendulum. Pendulum swings are never good. My sister, I explained that to her before. Pendulum swings are never good. You know why, Dave? Because they're only right briefly.
Right, I got that.
Only right briefly. So we don't want pendulum swings. So your friend here is a good example of feeling that. Remember a woman, I dealt with her for many months, and she was suicidal, tried to commit suicide many times, trying to get at the bottom of it, can't talk, hours and hours, and finally one day she said, they wouldn't let me grieve. I said, what? What? They wouldn't let me grieve. When, what? Oh, my husband was buried. They wouldn't let me grieve. They had this mass, they had white vestments. The priest talked all these positive things. They had these little kids there singing dippity songs. It was terrible. They wouldn't let me grieve. The whole liturgy didn't work for her. The whole liturgy was false. The liturgy was all about peace and joy. And she was madder than hell at her husband for dying and leaving her alone. And she was grieving. And nobody spoke that. The priest didn't talk about protest. The priest didn't talk about the cross and life. It was all too positive. So when we get all this too much positive stuff, you miss the Paschal mystery, as Dr. Gallardi would know better than most, being so keyed in that. The right answer is always the Paschal mystery. That is the death and resurrection. You don't have Easter without Good Friday. And Good Friday without Easter is a masochistic mess.
Well, can I push on this a little bit?
No.
Well, because I think you're touching on something very important, but I want to invite you to follow up on, you named really well sort of when the pendulum was swinging in the what we'll call preconciliar Catholicism with a kind of scrupulosity about sin and in ways that just, it seems to me, felt false or foreign to people's experience. But what what I want to invite you to do is to say something, what's an alternative way of talking about sin? I'm not sure I've heard that as much as I'd like.
As a matter of fact, you didn't hear that. And I'm very glad for that. Yeah, we got to find a language for sin. We can't put it into a zone of silence. So, how are we going to do that? One of the ways that I like to do it is to talk about the human experience that we have in disappointing ourselves, in failing to live up to our own ideals. You know, where our behavior does not match the best instincts of our heart, where the way we're acting on a daily basis falls short of what we'd like to be. We would say, I don't measure up. I'm good here, I'm fine here, I'm dealing well with my wife and my kids, but here on the job, I don't treat my colleagues right, I failed there. Now, some of that failure would be culpable. That is blameworthy. That is, it would be sin. So we find a way of talking about sin that fits in with this turn to the subject, not violating some objective law out there, which would be more below decks. Going back to that original image of KR, below decks, sin is breaking the law. On the top deck, I want to talk about sin in personal terms, and in terms of not living up to my ideals, or bringing discord into relationships, or failing to acknowledge my God in the way I should. So now I've got a language I think that people can deal with, and what I can do now in speaking that way is invite a very personal examination. We can do that right now. That everybody could try to think, what ideal do I most miss? Where is the biggest gap? I mentioned my teacher, Father Bernard Herring, before. Father Herring always said that the great art of growing spiritually, becoming a better person, overcoming the obstacles that we call sin, is to know what is the precise one next step I should take to move forward. And that's great for the spiritual growth. You say, well, I'm going to become better during Lent. Well, the odds of becoming better during Lent are 0. Now, if somebody says during Lent, I am going to gossip less, and I'm especially going to say positive things about this neighbor who can take a vacation 4 times a year while I'm home working all the time, I'm going to say something nice about her. So, in other words, you can gear in. See what I'm saying? That with this sort of approach, we cannot not talk about sin. Sin is a reality. We're threatened by sin and guilt. It's part of reality. Guilt is healthy. Feel guilty about not doing your job, well then maybe that would move you to do your job. So guilt can be a very good thing. We should deal with that. And talk of sin, it's important. Now people experience guilt in different ways today. When Luther said his first Mass, and he got to the part about being unworthy, he came undone. He felt it in his being, in his heart, I'm not worthy. I could be damned to hell. He felt it right in his first Mass. Now, there's not many people who feel that way anymore. There's some, but there's just not a whole lot of people who just are really worried they're going to get damned if they die tomorrow. Few, but not as much. That's why we got to find another way to talk about guilt, because that isn't how people experience guilt today. It's the gap between performance and ideal, between what the gospel calls us to be and how I actually behave. Next.
Growing up.
Sorry.
Transition.
Yeah, right. Sharp transition.
That's all right. Well, the problem is we just finished talking about sin, and so now I'm a little reluctant to segue into sex, because part of the problem is the way, in fact, our understanding of sexuality has been...
Yeah, but we can't have a conversation on the human person without that.
Absolutely. And so maybe my entree into this is going to be the contributions of the late Pope John Paul II. And I want to talk about a couple of his contributions, but one of his contributions, clearly, I think to this point, the most influential pope, for good or for bad, in the last 100 years, longest reigning pope since Pius IX in the 19th century. And one of the things that he did that I think was very good as a pope was to, in a very positive way, focus on our experience of embodiment as fundamental to what it is to be human. And to give a very positive reading of what it is to be embodied. And he also offered, I think, a very positive, though quite frankly, kind of provocative account of how our experience of sexuality is inextricably linked to that sense of embodiment. Now the problem is that it seems to me many of the really pressing questions that our church is facing today has to do with how exactly we fit our experience of sexuality into a theology of what it is to be embodied. I mean, it comes up in questions about homosexuality, it comes up in understandings of the ordination of women, it comes up in our understanding of marriage and marital sexuality. So how do we sort of sort out or articulate a healthy sense of how our sense of sexuality is wrapped up in our sense of embodiment?
Yes, and my sister told me when I was giving a lecture one time on Christian approaches to sexuality, she says, "You're going to lecture on that for an hour?" She says, "I can give it in 3 words. No, no, and no." However, John Paul II tried to take a very positive viewpoint of all of this. John Paul II wrote his doctoral dissertation was called The Acting Person. It's actually a terrific work, and it's very influenced by modern thought. It's very influenced by the modern turn to the subject, following Descartes and Rahner's approach and all that. The acting person. And his whole idea was that we come to our fulfillment by our actions, by doing. And said some of our actions make a difference in the world. And some of our actions go back and change us. Some of them have more of the effect of making us to be who we will be. So I would start out by saying he had a fine personalist philosophy. And he used it in many of his writings. And I always think that when he was working out of that framework, that he wrote some of his best stuff. We also said, I would probably go beyond what you said about his tremendous influence. I mean, it's hard to overestimate his influence. He became, as you well know, he took over your job. Not only was he the focal point of unity, but he became the theologian for the church in every area, including sexuality. And he did that through a series of lectures he gave on, over 128 lectures or something over a 5-year period, all on what he called the theology of the body. So, theology of the body. And that's become very well known. A lot of our young people know it, and Christopher West has popularized it and so on. A lot of books written about it. And in that notion, we get a very positive notion of the human body as going to share in the redemption, that shares in the creation, shares in the sanctification of the world. And so he's very clear we are not a soul stuck in a body, we are embodied spirits. In that, he's very biblical, very influenced by the book of Genesis. And one of the things that he said was that when we say that we're made in the image and likeness of God, he said that what is connected with that is that God made them male and female. And as male and female, they're in the image and likeness of God. So that it is that sexual relationship between a man and a woman that image is what God is all about. So that that couple becomes a communion in partnership, as we call it, a loving communion. And as such, it represents what God is all about, a loving communion of the 3 persons. So he begins to talk about the nuptial spirituality that comes out of that the human beings are made for one another like that, male and female. Now the other big text, and some people will be thrilled to hear this, is Ephesians 5. very much of the whole talks were based on Ephesians 5. And need I remind some people here, it's not their favorite text, but it says something like, men are the head of the woman, and the wives are to be subject to their husbands. It says more than that, but it talks about imitating Christ. And he says that nuptial spirituality is what we need to foster. And that there is a complementarity between the male and the female. Now, it's interesting how he talks about that. He talks about it in what we come to call a heterogenital way. That is, the man and the woman are made to come together. The penis and the vagina. There it is. That's what he's talking about. And that's how God made us. And that is to foster and bring about that communion of persons. And you see it biologically. You see it anatomically. This is really becomes important as he carries out the argument. The anatomical side of this. And he said, and then, so the people, the male and the female come together in the marital union. And the husband is in charge of the wife. He's the priority person here, so on. And the wife is the receptive one in this physical act, and in the reproductive complementarity that comes from that. That's how we produce children. So you end up with an anthropology that's big on complementarity in many different ways. Now, that leads the Pope to many of his conclusions about the area of moral theology and how human beings ought to act. One of the things you'd immediately see is that it rules out homosexual physical relationships because it violates what the nuptial relationship is all about, what the real human relationship, which is male and female, is all about. So the gay people coming together like that are not true to that biological truth about human beings. It also is the reason for ruling out contraception. So contraception ends up making intercourse a lie. That's the essential argument. And he thinks that that's rooted in Ephesians 5 and in Genesis, early chapters. In other words, he claims something that Pope Paul VI didn't claim, that there is a revelatory or biblical basis for against contraception. That you that violates it, that you come together to reproduce, the husband and the wife, and the contraception violates that. That's the language used. It violates the truth of that relationship. So, and this, just to extend that a bit, this is also why he argues that essentially women can't be priests. In other words, he believes it's not just what do we call it, a disciplinary thing, but that is an essential truth in it. That he's got this whole thing. Christ is the bridegroom in relationship to the church. He's male in relationship to the church. Mary represents the church, the feminine. The church is feminine. Christ is masculine. Christ takes the initiative in that relationship. Christ is head of the church. Now, his argument, again, anatomical, which is interesting in itself, is that women, metaphysically, essentially, ontologically, essentially, fundamentally cannot be priests. That's why they say these ordinations of women that we've had lately are invalid. They're not possibly ordained, even though a bishop ordained them. Can't possibly do it because the matter isn't there.
But by that logic, the rest of us were the church. Only women can then be in the church, right?
Well, no.
It used to work that way.
Yeah, you have a very logical mind. As a matter of fact, that he doesn't think that. He thinks, the Pope believes, always believed, that he was the great champion for women. He saw himself that way. That he spoke up for women more than anybody else. And in this complementarity that he talked about, it was almost always in terms of the male has the role in the public sphere. The male is going to remake the world, humanize the world, Christian, and the woman is going to attend to the domestic matters. She is going to bear children, and she's going to take care of the home and raise the children. In his language about him, always talked that way. And I think that he felt that that was raising up the true nature of women and really giving them, therefore, a role in the church. And he lauded the role of women in the church, and he expanded the role of women in the church. But in terms of becoming priests, no, because they couldn't be the icon, the replica, the exemplar of Jesus, the male, in relationship to the people they served. That's the fundamental argument. So, the sexuality that comes out of John Paul II, we can use it a lot for our young people and for everybody because of his reverence for the body. I mean, a culture in which we got so much anorexia and so many women with poor bodily images and upset with their genetic package that they've been given, so unable to deal with that. Got a culture like that. We got a growing problem with men that way in our culture. We're overboard on so many aspects of that. We got to stay younger and all of that. We got bodily problems in the culture. And so we can easily go back to Pope John Paul II and say, well, let's take out of this what's good, And that theology of the body is good, but we are to be grateful for the gift we have. It's as much a gift from God as our soul is. And it's going to share in the redemption as much as the soul is. And it's graced right now as much as the soul is. That's all good stuff. The dignity of the body. I just get to one more thing that I know married couples have trouble with. John Paul talks in the marital relationship about the total self-donation. That in the act of intercourse, that the couple is called to give totally of themselves to the other person. And I know in talking to married couples, when they read that, it sounds like overblown. It sounds too idealistic. It sounds like it doesn't really match their experience of lovemaking and marriage. It doesn't have the realism of the problem of finding time or being out of sorts or not into it or all the other things that can go on in that marital relationship. So that's another criticism that would come from the experience of people in talking about John Paul II. One of the things we try to do here, Rick, I don't know if I ever explained this to you, because it's to stop on time.
That's a priority for you, right? Well, we are. We're at 6:30, and so, right?
Yeah.
Like that. So I think what we'll do is thank Brother Basic, first of all, for his as is our custom, we'll take a little 4 to 5 minute break, and then
1 or 2 minutes.
1 or 2 minutes, excuse me, break, and then we'll invite people to raise their hands, and we can get a mic to you, and you can pose a question.
He said it was a terrible time to stop. I mean, everybody knows that there would be dissent within the church on that kind of papal teaching. And there would be strong dissent within the theological community in the United States and among feminist theologians at the very basis of it, that is the heterogenital complementarity. There would be a strong sense that you have to place that biological approach into a larger framework of personalism. That men and women come together not just as genital creatures, but with emotions and with history and so on. And there's all kinds of other things that go into the relationship, especially love and care, and mutuality, and so on. So, I mean, I guess I just sort of presume, I mean, that's the Pope's position, and, you know, the whole theology of the body is not dogma or something that's put forward. That's he's speaking as a theologian, trying to pull the tradition together in various ways. And there's clearly dissent to that, and especially at the most fundamental level. I mean, there's not a whole lot of theologians in the United States who accept that complementarity notion. In fact, you know, I mean, you know, somebody at one extreme would be Rosemary Ruther. Rosemary Ruther would just go ballistic over that, and she does. And she would say, I don't want to hear any talk about differences between men and women, because as soon as that happens, I'm going to lose. So I was in a conversation with Rosemary one time, and she's a biological mother, and I made a comment that, well, being a biological mother, I would presume that would influence, in a sense, your image of God and your sense of God and so on. And Rosemary looked at me and said, bullshit. I didn't take that as an invitation to dialogue. But she explained to me then and on other occasions, if I let you shape the dialogue and tell me about my experiences as a mother, I'm going to lose, and I'm not going to let you do that. I'll tell you what it means to be a mother. You're not going to tell me. And I think that Rosemary had a fundamentally important, good point there. I respected that point. You know, I'll tell you what it's like to be a mother. You're not going to tell me. And this is what, you know, so Rosemary would stand at another extreme of saying, I'm not talking about any differences. I don't care what they are. You know. And now I think there's many feminists who would move in a direction of saying, well, maybe we can talk about some differences between men and women, and we could discuss those as long as we didn't allow them, your set of values or accomplishments or talents are superior to mine. As long as you, the male, don't allow that, then we can talk about it and see if indeed we could find some things that are different, that we could agree on. Or that, my own approach to that is to forget all the male and female stereotyping. When I do the marriage preparation thing, I invite the students, I tell them, you know, I'll suggest two primary needs to you. One for autonomy and respect, where the great fear is to fail. The other one is for intimacy and closeness, and where the great fear is to be alone. And then I'll say, talk to your partner about which one is your primary emotional need. Now I can tell you 20 years ago in doing that, if I would ask them, raise your hand, of how many people primary emotional need is for autonomy and respect and success and fear of failure, you would have gotten, out of these 20 people in the room, 10 couples, 10 male hands that raised. And if I gave the other thing about fear of being alone and wanting intimacy, I'd have got 10 female hands. But I don't do that. And now I would ask that question, open-ended, totally, where are you on that? And you'll get a tremendous mixture. I've had classes where more women will say success and autonomy, and more men will say intimacy. So it's clearly a difference in my own experience in dealing with young couples in how that sorts out these days. It's my way of coming at the question of differences. The important thing is for that couple to know what's the primary emotional need of my spouse. That's what's important. I don't care if it's a female stereotype or not, it doesn't matter. What you got to do is meet that need. That's my approach to that there's differences, but let the people sort it out themselves. Yes?
You answered my question.
Incredible. I mean, we should add you up here instead of Rick. No, Rick, you know, Rick's going to do this for everybody, even for himself. No. and that was very good. I appreciate it. He put it, actually, I've seen the questions, yeah. He has written out questions for all the speakers, and they're terrific.
Father Basic.
Yes.
I'm coming from a little different perspective here, and that is responsible parenthood. As a parent, having had 4 children in 3.5 years and then another one later, because I followed the church and I had to get permission to practice rhythm from the priest. And I'm telling you, that's the truth. And there are many people who, the whole idea of birth control is coming back that it's a no-no. I mean, it's gaining a little bit of momentum. And I think that's irresponsible parenting. And when I think about, I just spent some time with a friend who was in Africa for 3 months, and she told me that birth control is essential because women are having babies year after year after year. They're starving to death. And so there's a whole nother picture here that I don't think the Pope thought about.
Good. Thanks, Ann. I want to give Ann credit, too, for my other comments earlier. She's the one who told me, get this straightened out. I appreciate that. You know, in my own experience of dealing with young people, birth control, use of contraception is not a question. I can't remember the last time in dealing with a young couple that was an issue, where they brought it up and said, you know, what about this? Even as a question, I cannot remember the last time. Now, I can remember when I was first ordained a priest in the 1960s when a day didn't go by when that wasn't a question that was posed with great conviction and energy and sorrow. So you are right in saying that there are people in the hierarchy who are raising this again. You're right. I was in Washington during one of the bishops' meetings, and one of the bishops came running out and said, "You're not going to believe this, but they want to bring up birth control again." Now, you know, in the United States, there was a whole silence on that. How did our bishops respond to Humanae Vitae? Other than one, the Archbishop in Washington, no bishop that I know around the country made a case out of it. There were 17 priests in Washington. Cardinal Boyle said that he suspended them for not holding the church position on birth control. But that is interesting because it's so anomalous. I don't know where that happened any other place. The American bishops, like the Canadian bishops, like the Mexican bishops, played it down. They made a conscious decision. We're not going to fire our priests who see it differently. We're not going to make a big deal out of it. They essentially put it into a zone of silence for many years. And that's why none of the young people I deal with bring it up. It's just not on their radar screen anymore. So, but you're absolutely right. There were, and Rick would know a lot more about this than I do, but the bishops have brought it up and talked about it again. And there's a movement to say maybe we got to get stronger on this again. And it's all connected in a lot with that whole theology of the body and so on. Yeah. But is that going to have any effect? I mean, it's hard for me to believe that that movement will do anything to the consciences of young people today. if it starts to happen, I mean, I'd be interested in that.
A few things that I have read, this is changing all sexuality to the end of life. It seems like the church is changing their position to the point where the body is to be maintained with tube feeding, and America just had an article on it. Is there a change?
Well, yes, it goes back to Pope John Paul II again. Again, Rick would be able to deal with this better than I can, but there's, Pope John Paul II spoke about everything, every topic. He became the expert on every topic. It didn't matter what it was, philosophy, reason and faith, euthanasia, abortion, every topic. I believe is unprecedented in the history of Christianity, where the Pope played not only the role of the focal point of unity, which is so important, but also became the theological expert on every question. So he did make a comment, and I don't remember the exact context. Where's Rick? Is he going to help me? The exact context of this. But he did say things about you couldn't remove hydration and nutrition. And the theologian in the United States heard that and said, well, where did that come from? There's been a constant tradition and well respected that you didn't have to do this. My sister and I lived through this. My father had the most simple device in his forearm, an IV. And we, with the doctors, had him take out, my father was in a persistent vegetative state, and we had him take out the IV. That's hardly extraordinary means. As far as I know, nobody in our family ever thought another thing about it. I know I didn't. It just seemed like the right thing to do because there was a whole consensus among theologians that keeping people alive is not an absolute. We've never said that the physical life is an absolute. We've never said that. We've always said there's reasons why you could give up your life. You could give up your life to save your daughter. Physical life has never been an absolute. We're people who believe in heaven. Like we're on a journey. We're going someplace. Going to another life. So there's always been situations. Everybody, on the abortion thing, we always said that if the mother's life was threatened by the infant in utero, that you could have a hysterectomy to save the wife. That was a constant teaching. It wasn't even debated. So we had all of that, and then the Pope made this remark in some sort of conference or something. And, no claim to infallibility or claim to anything like that. And now people have picked it up. And now the debate is changed because of that. And something that was just assumed is now become a new question. And because of that very statement by the Pope. And that's his power. I mean, that's power still there. He's an immense person. I mean, he's brilliant. I mean, so with all his languages, he could assimilate material. When Bishop Under went to see him, he knew more about Saginaw than Bishop Under did. I mean, he knew everything about everything. It was unbelievable. But that's the result of it. That's what's happened as a result. We're on the human person.
Father, I just had a question. We're talking about the human person, and I want to get at it. It just seemed you were mentioning John Paul II, human sexuality, and the body, the spirit embodies, the body's embodied in the spirit, but focusing on the male and female, I don't know if I can word this just right, but isn't that kind of a narrow approach to love and relationships? I mean, we're more than our sexual coupling, and I don't know why gay people in their loving relationship two women or two men or a group of people together can decide they want to raise a child together or to love other people. I just think the bigger picture would be, are we caring and loving for each other and questioning, am I doing the right thing now? Am I being the best person I can be, and work in relationships?
Yeah. I mean, that's the whole thrust of what we call personalism among moral theologians. A lot of that goes back to the work of, and these are in the notes, the Jewish philosopher Martin Buber, who influenced whole generations of Christian theologians by his notion of I, thou. That in relationships, there's two kinds, I, it, and I, thou. I, it is to treat the other person like a thing, like an object for pleasure or to be manipulated or controlled. And Buber said there's another way of thinking about relationships which he called I, thou, where the other is a thou. The other is to be reverenced and respected and enter into a relationship of mutuality characterized by dialogue and so on. And where you get a whole different sense of what human relationships are all about. And I think that sort of personalism has come into much of the talk about, among others, outside of John Paul II's theology of the body, of how you see human relationships. And it opens up other things that are important in a relationship. And not just the genital sex, but also the affectivity, the emotions, the involvement, the care, the love, the forgiveness that's needed in relationship to make them work and so on. So that is what I think of as a broader personalism that forms a framework for thinking through all these other questions. Somebody sort of critiquing the Pope said, well, he's concerned with a lot of bodies, but there's a whole lot of bodies left out. The bodies of gay people, or the bodies of celibates, bodies of married couples who can't have intercourse. So all kind of things left out in a sense when it becomes that biological. So I appreciate your point, Bob, that we need to find ways, seems to me, to enlarge the conversation about sexuality and complementarity. Yes, you got a microphone.
You mentioned that the sexuality of a male and female, and you came up with a reason why a female couldn't become a priest. It makes no sense to me whatsoever. And I'd like you to speak a little bit more on that, because to me, there's no reason at all why a female could not become a priest.
Yeah, that flows out of that for sure. I mean, we call that argument the iconic argument that I rehearsed from John Paul II. And it's actually held by that other giant of 20th century thought, that's Hans Urs von Balthasar. He worked out this iconic argument that's used by the Pope. And I mean, I can tell you, Balthasar is one of the most brilliant persons who ever lived on the face of the earth. I mean, Balthasar, I would say he had a better grasp of the long Christian tradition than my mentor, Karl Rahner, did. For me to say that is a lot. I mean, he was a genius. He was a classical pianist. He gave away all of his Mozart scores because he knew them by heart. I mean, this man was unbelievably a genius. And he worked out this iconic argument. Women can't be the icon of Jesus. Now, when if you raise the question outside of that narrow framework, then, again, Karl Rahner wrote a very important article saying that there is no reason that he can understand why women can't become priests. And that the burden of proof to restrict that is on the magisterium. It's not on other people to say why they can become, because you would presume they could become priests. But that the burden of proof is on the magisterium bishop and the pope, to show why can't they? And he says the arguments used don't hold. The fundamental argument is that Jesus picked no one in his circle of 12. Well, the 12 were the official witnesses. And in that culture, it was impossible for women to be official witnesses. Jesus broke a lot of taboos with women. He spoke to them in public. He traveled with them. That was unheard of. They were in his retinue. That was the women from Galilee who were down there when he was crucified. So he traveled with them, talked to them in public. All of that was totally taboo in that culture. So he broke a lot of taboos. But he couldn't break that one because they couldn't serve as the official witness by being the 12. So he says the fundamental argument that's used, apart from the iconic argument, when I say that, I know what I mean, the anatomical argument. Apart from that argument, that's the other argument, that Jesus didn't pick anybody. And Ronner says, it doesn't hold. Now you tell me why we can't do it. What's your next argument? You know, what's the next argument? Well, when you begin to look at the biblical period again, and this is what's so important about raising up Mary Magdalene, who's now the apostle to the apostles. You know, it's interesting. Paul does not mention Magdalene as one of the witnesses to Jesus' resurrection. He doesn't mention her. He has a whole list of people. He's got 500 people. A whole list. There's a name of 500, but he names, 12, James, Peter, to me. Doesn't mention Mary Magdalene. Now, the Gospels make it clear that she was an early witness to the resurrection. She was the apostle of the apostles. We had a woman apostle. We know her name, Junia. Paul talks about her in chapter 16 of Romans. So we know women were apostles. But they weren't 12. 12 apostles, the two words don't go together. The 12 is a technical term for official witnesses. This is important for the argument about whether women can be ordained or not. Apostles is a much broader word. There's a whole lot more apostles than 12. Paul's an apostle, Byron's an apostle, Junia is an apostle. You got a whole lot of apostles, more than the 12. So there was no problem in the early church in having them to be apostles. So that's Ronner's position. Freedom should prevail unless you have a compelling argument to restrict freedom. And his claim is that the hierarchy has no compelling argument. So, I mean, you can talk about it pragmatically too. What happens in the church when you rule out half the people to be ordained? One thing that might happen is you get a sex abuse scandal. Why? Because you got a much smaller pool of people to choose from. You have much more lenient approaches to who you let in. As soon as you expand the pool, you got a better chance of getting better people. I have no illusion, suddenly you're going to have women priests and everything's going to be beautiful. No way. We got a doctrine called original sin. It preserves us from that kind of utopian thinking. Reinhold Niebuhr says the one empirically verifiable Christian doctrine. And we all know that. So it's not illusory. But it would certainly expand the pool of candidates, and it would bring in a whole other set of gifts that would help. So you could argue it that way, too, on the positive side. No compelling argument against, and you've got reasons why it would enrich the church.
I have, as an lecturer, one of the most awful times reading, I guess, Ephesians 5, when you talk about the woman being dedicated to her husband, and husband to wives, and such.
That's a kind word.
And, well, I'm trying to be kind.
Yeah.
But it really takes me off. I hate reading. I almost choke when I have to read it. And it just seems like all the lecturing go around and that one gets to me. And I have tried to figure a way to sound it out and not get so steamed. And I haven't managed to do that yet.
Oh, I was hoping you would share how to do that.
No, I have not.
You haven't
I have decided after, I come from a long environment of where if there needed to be strong women, because there wasn't an opportunity for men to be as strong as they could be, and it just seems like it just doesn't fit us. It just doesn't fit the African American community at all, because that's not the way it worked. You know what I mean?
I do.
Oh, right.
I've seen people handle it, there's supposed to be lectures up here, and that women don't read it. We've had that happen.
Yeah, I wanted to skip it over a little bit.
Yeah, they tucked it into that zone of silence I was talking about, and folded it there. Scriptures are written in a patriarchal period. All of the books of the Bible are written by men. You have to, that's a contextual point that we have to deal with. Oh.
Then what I want to know is if there were so many women around, and these women were so clever, they came to be doctors, they came to be disciples, they came to be advisors, they came to be people to be listened to, why the heck, if women get to be so low on the totem pole? Sir?
Hey, I'm with you. I'm never going to be a bishop. It's well known that it's a litmus test to become a bishop. It has been since all through Pope John Paul II's reign that no person could be made a bishop chosen by a favored women's ordination. Commonly known. Am I right, Rick? Commonly known. So, I just ruled myself out. I'll stand with you. Let's call it a night.